Welcome everybody. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome Paul Tucker to be with us. He's visiting us from Harvard. And of course he's known to be the deputy governor from the Bank of England. He has shaped the global financial architecture. He's one of the deep thinkers who thinks about deep questions, and we talked over lunch about how he can combine the independence of central banks and taking on more and more tasks with democracy. How does this square up? And today he will talk about the securities market and what went wrong and what can we do better.
Thank you for inviting me to come here. It's been a real delight being here today. I haven't been here for years, and I'd forgotten how staggeringly beautiful the Princeton campus is. Maybe the best of any of the elite universities in the world. And I went to Cambridge, England, which is a very beautiful place. The advertised title of my talk is The Crisis, or the incipient crisis in securities regulation. Actually, it's got a question mark. Is there a crisis, an incipient crisis in securities regulation? And I'm going to stand behind here a bit of the time so I can see my notes. If you think about financial reform over the past few years, it amounts to things like banks should have more capital, banks should have more liquidity, banks should be less interconnected, banks should be less opaque, banks should be able to fail without a taxpayer bailout. You could be forgiven. I think that's a pretty coherent program, by the way, that is based on good economic principles that are documented in the scholarly community. But you could be forgiven for asking the question, is it all about banks? And the answer is not remotely, in fact, even though most of the headline stuff is about banks. There's derivatives reform. There's reform of the secured money markets, what people call the repo markets. There is reform of the securitization markets. There is reform of the clearing houses that serve markets. There is reform of the credit rating agencies that rate securities that are sold into the capital markets. Now, as it happens, I think that that set of reforms, whilst pretty good, is less coherent and well-based than an articulated account of what reformers are trying to achieve. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is more or less everywhere that list of things falls to securities regulators, not to central banks, not to bank supervisors. And then there's an intermediate sphere, which is what's come to be known as shadow banking. So these are financial businesses or transactions or structures that do not have the de jure form of banks, but can replicate the economic substance of banks, which is essentially borrowing short, lending to households and firms, so that they're both leveraged and have a maturity mismatch, and so can unravel in the way that banks can unravel when there is a depositor or short-term creditor run. And in most countries, again, most manifestations of shadow banking fall under the jurisdiction of securities regulators, not under the jurisdiction of bank supervisors or central banks. And so this crisis is affecting reform of central banks and securities regulators in a completely different way. What's happening with central banks and bank supervisors is they're being shoved back into their history. Many, as with the Federal Reserve in this country, were created partly to help preserve financial stability and drifted away from that part of their mission probably during the 1990s and in the first half of the current century. So they're being pushed back into an old mandate, but where the mandate was and remains focused on the aggregate system, the monetary system, the banking system, the system as a whole. For securities regulators, I think something much more profound and challenging is going on. They're being brought into a world where they're effectively being required to contribute to preserving financial stability. And that is I would say requires a challenge for their mandate, a challenge for their decision-making techniques and processes, and a challenge for their international relationships as well. In other words, what's happening with securities regulators is that they're becoming not just enforcers of the law, but also high policy makers. And what I want to talk about in this lecture is how that gives rise to a series of political economy challenges for securities regulators that I think, if not addressed, will either end up being a challenge of competence or a challenge of authority, or both. So I think the stakes are pretty high, and I'm going to talk about three ways into this issue, and they're overlapping, but they're also separable. The first is the independence of securities regulators, and by securities regulators, I should say I mean things like the Securities and Exchange Commission, which I refer to throughout as the SEC, and the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission in this country, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, the European Securities Markets Authority in Europe. These bodies exist everywhere in the world. Almost every country, jurisdiction has one. They are typically independent, I'm going to put that in quotes for a second, from government so as to insulate themselves, so as to insulate them from day-to-day politics. And I want to address why they're insulated from day-to-day politics, whether they are in fact, and whether any of that needs to change in the light of what I see as their developing mandate. The second set of issues I'll discuss is about rule books. The stock in trade for a central bank is you have a monthly meeting, or in this country a 6-weekly meeting, and decide the level of interest rates. And it's an error correction process. You come back 6 weeks' time and decide whether to reset your interest rate. So you can make small mistakes and correct for them, and you can correct, even if you haven't made any mistakes, as the environment changes, you're changing your compass slightly. Securities regulators write rule books. And the second set of issues I want to discuss is whether that is going to be effective in sustaining financial stability, the stability of those parts of the financial system that fall under the jurisdiction of securities regulators. And if not, how that, again, plays into the issue of independence. And the third set of issues is about globalization, if you like, which is, can national securities regulators do this on their own? And if they unavoidably have to cooperate with their counterparts abroad, how can that be squared with democratic legitimacy, given that they are created by an answer to national parliaments, Congress in this country? So let me start with the first of those issues, the independence of securities regulators. And I'll focus mainly on the United States. Since the progressive era, and in particular since the New Deal, when the SEC was created, this country and later other countries have been creating independent agencies. Agencies that are designed to be insulated to a greater or lesser degree from day-to-day politics, because politicians prioritize getting re-elected, as well as on delivering the public policy goals that they have articulated through legislation. Monetary policy is an absolutely obvious example of this. Why are central banks independent? They're independent because high and variable inflation does very few people any good. So the society on the whole wants low and stable inflation, but if you left politicians with the interest rate instrument, they'd always be tempted to cheat. The canonical story is in the run-up to an election, they will allow the economy to be slightly stronger than it should be. They will allow a demand boom, a credit boom, an asset price boom. They reap the advantages of the popularity and only deal with the problems afterwards. it is much less clear why securities regulators should be independent. And it's unclear why other independent agencies in general should be independent. And political scientists have identified a whole series of reasons which are not particularly persuasive in a normative sense. They may be very persuasive in terms of it being the motivation of politicians when they created these agencies. One is to shift blame from the politicians to unelected officials. Another one might be, in this country in particular, because if the Congress is in the hands of a different party from the president, and something needs to be done and an agency needs to be created, the Congress may not want to hand over so much discretionary power to the president and his or her administration. And another reason, it could just be fashion. Institutional sociologists have documented pretty well that part of the reason for the spread of central bank independence was it just became regarded as a good thing, and you didn't dare operate your newly democratic state without an independent central bank. It seemed to be a good thing. Everyone else was doing it. You didn't want to take the risk of not doing it. But those are all, however valid they are, those don't really make a normative case for independence of the kind that I sketched for monetary policy independence. And why should, in particular, securities regulators be independent? Now, the best argument that can be made, and I think the one that probably weighed with people most historically, was they were in the business of keeping markets fair, of protecting people against fraud, and therefore they were essentially in the disclosure enforcement business, ensuring a degree of disclosure by issuers of securities, including a degree of disclosure amongst traders of securities in markets. And if people breached, abused those disclosure obligations, or did insider trading or committed fraud against each other, on each other, then the SEC or securities regulator would enforce the law or the rules, whether via the court system or via administrative action or via an injunction. And that's a function that you do want to have insulated from day-to-day politics, in the way that you want the courts and the prosecuting authorities generally to be insulated from day-to-day politics. And this was underlined during the 1970s. One of the things that is forgotten about the Nixon administration is that at one point they tried to interfere in some SEC investigations. They didn't succeed, although I think it is suggested that the then chairman of the SEC was prepared to accommodate the administration on this, and it caused a bit of a wobble in the SEC. So this was a world where securities regulators are essentially doing adjudication. Adjudication is something where our societies for 200 years plus have wanted independent officials to make the case-by-case judgments. And crucially, this approach of disclosure enforcement can also be popular if you're an independent agency. You're hunting down wickedness. That's highly salient. It tends to be popular with Congress. So there's not only a normative basis for your independence, but you can underpin it with bipartisan political support for what you're doing. Now, there was a bit of a wobble on this way of thinking about securities regulation in the late 1970s when the stock market crash occurred in 1987, which was not a crash caused by wickedness. It was a national, international economic event. The question was, well, where were the securities regulators, both of derivatives and of cash securities, in ensuring these markets had financial integrity in the sense of stability as well as in the sense of honesty? But not much came of that. It didn't transform the central mission of the SEC or its counterparts abroad. Now, at this point, I should confess that there's a sleight of hand in what I've said, because I've made it sound as though all they do is adjudication, and that's not quite true. Of course, they've always been writing rules. But I would suggest that big picture, those rules were largely seen to be balancing the different interests of different parts of the securities markets, the capital markets. They were holding the ring between fund management companies, corporate issuers, up to a point sovereign issuers, small intermediaries, big intermediaries. Very technical points, largely, not very salient with the public. Somebody needs to hold the ring. They were doing it. This is the high tide of interest group populism in a way of thinking about the role of government. There is no public interest. There are only different sectional interests. They need to be balanced. It's okay for an independent agency to balance those interests, provided the issues are fairly technical and don't have first order effects on the population. Well, whatever the merits of that view in the 1980s or 1990s, and I think it's probably pretty dubious then, it's blown out of the water by the global financial crisis. There are two features of the financial crisis that matter for these purposes. The first is that it was obviously very deep and the recovery is very slow, so it is of first order importance for the citizens of all of our countries in the West who've been affected by it. And the second is that the reforms cannot just be left to central bankers and bank supervisors because they don't have all of the relevant powers. If we are to avoid anything like this in future, the securities regulators community needs to be involved. And as I have already mentioned, there is reform of derivatives trading. There is increasingly attention to reform of the structure of markets. There are controls being put around shadow banking and clearing functions. Now, this is high policy, and it's high policy in the following sense, two senses. First of all, it actually affects everybody in the country, and probably everybody in the world, more or less. The second is that because it's to do with massive spillovers from financial crisis, because it's to do with massive negative externalities, you cannot think of it, that rule writing to prevent these crises, as being delivered through a doctrine of interest group populism. It is not about holding the ring between the asset management industry and the securities dealers and the banks on Wall Street, because none of them are going to internalize the costs of financial crisis. The public, of course, might, but the public is vastly spread by definition, and the issues are highly technical. These are circumstances in which government needs to form views and explain them to the country and get support for what is in the public interest. So these are really big decisions. How resilient should the financial system be? How resilient should a clearinghouse be? Should it be proof against something that can happen only every 1,000 years or every 100 years? Well, if you put it like that, well, why should those decisions be taken by unelected officials, be they in central banks or in securities regulators? And this is problematic because actually securities regulators have pretty vague objectives. Their statutory objectives are pretty vague. The objectives of most securities regulators are things like protect investors, and ensure markets are efficient and fair, promote capital formation. So you're balancing different things there. There's no ranking, typically. It's not like a lexicographic set of objectives for central banks. There isn't a lexicographic set of objectives in this country, but where I come from, price stability first, support the economy consistent with maintaining price stability. That wasn't decided by the Bank of England or by the ECB. That's decided by the political classes. Whereas these objectives aren't ranked at all, nor are they quantified in any way. Protect investors, how much? A lot, a bit? what would a lot mean? If you think again about central banking, not actually in this country, but in most other countries, the definition of price stability is set by the legislature, but the rate of inflation that the central bank is going to tolerate comes out of a political process as well. In the UK, the number 2% for the inflation target is set by the executive branch after debate in Parliament. Well, how much protect investors? A great deal, as I say, or hardly at all, and what even would those things mean? I've no idea. And also notice that there's no mention of financial stability at all. If you want to incorporate financial stability into these objectives, then you have to interpolate between the words. And actually, in the SEC's case, you can find grounds for that to the preamble of the 1934 Act that created the SEC. Just to put a bit of colour on this, there was recently a debate about reform of US money market funds. And when I say recently, it actually went on for some years, and it was highly controversial both within the United States and between the United States and other countries. It unleashed the most ferocious episode of lobbying by the industry that I encountered in my career, and it split the SEC Commission for a number of years. The previous chair of the SEC couldn't get a majority for reform. There is now a form of reform going through. Now, a lot of people around the world have been very frustrated about this. But one way of thinking about it is, well, it's not very surprising actually if Congress, and the same could apply in other countries as well, these aren't just points about the US, but in this case, if Congress hasn't given a clear steer that it expects the SEC to be cognizant of risks to financial stability. It's not surprising if Congress is more or less silent on the issue that SEC commissioners could form very different views, because what they're doing is they're effectively trading views on what the public policy objectives should be, rather than taking the public policy objectives and determining how to deliver them. So let's stack that there for a second. So that's a suggestion that securities and regulators are now unavoidably in the financial stability business, but their statutory mandates either doesn't empower them to pursue that, or more modestly, they are empowered to do it, but they get no guidance from the legislature about how to do it, what more precisely the objective should be, and so they end up being in the position of the politicians and determining the objectives. Let me now take another cut, which is, how independent are they? And this is a really quite fascinating question about independent agencies in general. So the Federal Reserve is pretty damn independent. No one can change their decisions without an act of Parliament. The same is true in the United Kingdom, more or less. In fact, in the securities field and with other independent agencies here, it's not quite as straightforward as that. Although the members of the commissions of the SEC, CFTC, and the various other commissions have tenure, in the language of lawyers, they can only be fired by the president for cause. He or she can't get out of bed and decide that they don't much like the SEC's policy, and so everyone's fired. President Roosevelt tried that with the Federal Trade Commission in the 1930s, and the Supreme Court found against him, although they were in a mode to do that at the time. The commissioners can't be fired on a whim by the president, but there is a convention that the chair of the commission will offer the president his or her resignation on a change of administration, at least on a change of colour of the administration. And mostly, when that happens, the chair would exit. And so the balance, an incoming president has an opportunity to change the balance on the commission from 3-2 in the favour of one party to 3-2 in the favour of their own party. They'll assume that they've got 3 votes sympathetic to their project. So that gives the president a certain amount of leverage, once in a while at least, over Commission policy. But the Congress is armed too, because although the Congress has given these agencies vague objectives, the Congress also decides their budget, and it can decide their budget in an almost line-by-line, prescriptive or proscriptive way each year, which gives them quite a lot of leverage over agency policy. I don't mean that these agencies aren't independent at all, but they don't have the degree of independence that central banks typically have. Now, what I want to suggest is, I think it's very important that there should be control by the democratically elected politicians over independent agencies, people like me in the past. But I want to suggest that this is the wrong kind of control. This is tactical control rather than strategic control. Whereas if what you want to do is set up an independent agency that is going to preserve financial stability, you want people that can, without fear or favor, pursue a policy that is consistent with the objective, the clear objective they've been given by the legislature, without worrying about whether that means their budget is going to be cut at the end of the year, or if the election goes one way or another, that the whole of the agency's policy is going to change. So that's my first exhibit, if you like, which is that conceptions of agency independence don't fit well if these agencies are partly responsible for preserving financial stability, because that is partly a question of being able to make credible commitments. And for that, you need less tactical control by elected politicians, but more strategic control in the form of clear objectives, clearer objectives than protect investors. Second set of problems will kind of lead to much the same place, but is completely different, which is what securities regulators do is they write rule books. And there's a good reason for that. Why do legislators everywhere in the world want regulators to write rule books? Precisely because they don't want unelected officials to have arbitrary powers. Rule books are things that the world can see, are justiciable, they can be judicially reviewed, they can go up to the courts under administrative law. They have to go through consultation processes where all sections of society can pitch in and give their views. And I think actually the Western world should be pretty proud about the way that's developed over the past 80 years. It is a good way of limiting the powers of unelected officials. But it is problematic in this area because a static rulebook, emphasis on static rulebook, is absolutely the meat and drink of regulatory arbitrage. And by which I mean finding your way round or through the rulebook. And this is both prevalent in the financial system and particularly problematic in the financial system. It goes on everywhere, in all walks of life, but it is particularly prevalent and problematic in this area. It's prevalent because finance essentially is a shapeshifter. I've mentioned already that you can take banking and you can rebuild the economic substance of banking outside of a bank. You can build an insurance company as a portfolio of derivatives contracts. You can build a derivatives business as a portfolio of insurance contracts. And believe it or not, there are things called transformers, typically domiciled in the Cayman Islands, which on one side of their balance sheet have insurance contracts and another side of the balance sheet have derivatives contracts. They enable this transformation of insurance contracts into derivative contracts. Finance is, and it can be done quickly, and the fact that there aren't we have open capital markets, it means it can be done over a number of jurisdictions. That just means it's prevalent. It's problematic because if you try and regulate here through a static rulebook, the industry will replicate the thing that can create the tremendous social costs, the crisis over here outside of the regulatory perimeter. It's also problematic for another reason as well. So if you think about rules on capital or margin levels or haircuts, which are essentially excess collateral requirements, if these are static, they are assuming two things. First of all, a desired degree of resilience in the financial system, and secondly, that the underlying stochastic process that produces those risks is the same over time. But that isn't so. You can think of the financial system or the economy more generally as being in one of three states: a normal state, an exuberant state, and a depressed state. You can think these are like switches in the underlying stochastic process. So should you calibrate everything for the exuberant period of the world? Well, I don't think so, because that really would be a repression on financial activity. But if you calibrate things, your regulatory requirements, for the normal state of the world, well, then when you enter the exuberant state of the world, they're insufficient to deliver the degree of resilience that society requires. You need to be able to change them. So for those two reasons, static rule books are not going to work to preserve stability. The one is they'll be evaded, and the other is that the world will move into a kind of more exuberant state, and so the requirements you've got will prove insufficient. So what I'm arguing, of course, for is regulators to have a bit more discretion, to be more flexible, to be more nimble. Otherwise, they, given the first of those problems, they're in a game that they're doomed to lose. Finance moves from the regulated bit to the unregulated bit. By the time that regulators have caught up with that, this non-regulated bit, or less regulated bit, has become so powerful and rich that they're an effective lobby, and the regulators will then fight to bring it under control. But how on earth can we square giving more discretion to these unelected independent regulators with our democratic principles? I mean, we don't want to hand the keys of the kingdom over to independent agencies. And again, this comes back to framing the objectives in a more precise way than people have felt it necessary to do in the past for securities regulators. We need to constrain the discretion that they have by framing their objective appropriately, and then having the delivery of that objective and the actions they take monitored actively by Congress and the wider society. So that leads to the same place as the first set of problems. My third cut on the issue is national versus international, national policy making against global policy making. About 10 years ago, someone who was then at this university, Anne-Marie Slaughter, published a very interesting book, The New World Order, on transnational governmental organizations, things like Basel, where the central bankers hang out, or IOSCO, which is the International Organization for Securities Commissioners, which is where the securities commissioners hang out. And she said these had become increasingly potent as policymakers in the world. She makes the point rather more subtly than that. But actually things weren't quite what they seemed. It is true about Basel. I think what she said about Basel is true. There is no doubt that central bankers make policy on regulation collectively in Basel, subject then to a democratic process back at home. And why do they do that? There are people in the audience here who are better equipped to judge than me, but my guess would be that the gold standard and the Bretton Woods period inculcated in central banks that they were all in it together. They were in a world of interconnectedness and spillovers, and that their experience of the banking system was the same. Where did the banking crisis of this country come from in the 1920s and 30s? It started, the key moment was Kreditanstalt in Austria. In the 1970s, what prompted the creation of the Basel Supervisors Committee? The failure of Bankhaus Hestad in Germany. And yet these were initiatives that Americans and Japanese and everybody else from around the world were keen on because the central bank governors understood the spillovers from one part of the global banking system to another. They knew that they couldn't do enough to protect themselves on their own. The way I used to explain this to staff in the Bank of England is, would we be better off with everybody having a capital requirement of 10%, or us having a capital requirement of 20%, and everybody else having a capital requirement of 5%, or some of them having a capital requirement of 5%. And I was quite convinced that the UK would be better off if everybody had a standard that pushed them above where some of them wanted to be, because I didn't see how the UK could possibly insulate itself from banking crises in continental Europe or the United States. Now, I rehearsed that because that's not how IOSCO has worked until recently. IOSCO was essentially a forum for the exchange of information, for sharing expertise. So, I mean, that was a valuable thing in itself. And I think the experience of the big securities regulators in the world was, to the extent that there had to be some common principles, not standards, principles, then they could probably be confident that they would be followed. And that, of course, meant, first and foremost, US securities regulators. And that has changed since the crisis, for good or ill, as my little story about the money market fund industry showed. IOSCO agreed an outline of a policy for money market funds, and there were some SEC commissioners that didn't like it very much and didn't agree and weren't going to implement it. And my guess is that 20 years ago it wouldn't have become an IOSCO policy, but it did. And it became an IOSCO policy endorsed by the Financial Stability Board under the umbrella of the G20 finance ministers and leaders, including the US Finance Secretary, US Treasury Secretary, and President. Now, national securities regulators would probably say two things, one of which I think is untrue, and one of which I think is deeply true. The thing that they would say is untrue is that markets are still basically national. And I think that's not true. They would also say, and I think this is deeply true, but we were created for and answer to our domestic legislature. Democracy is still organized on national lines. And that is deeply true. IOSCO doesn't answer to a world parliament, and nor does the Basel Committee or the group of central bank governors. Now, something very interesting has been happening as a way of threading their way through that, which is legislatures and regulators have started to introduce extraterritorial policies. So Dodd-Frank, which reforms the US financial system, has in it a provision, which the exact language will be in the paper that I hope will be released tomorrow. Effectively, it says, this policy, you should set rules that will apply extraterritorially if the transactions have any connection, material connection to or impact on the United States. And of course, there has been some retaliation from elsewhere in the world, including Europe and including the parts of Asia. But think about this as a thought experiment. And this is hypothetical. So the dollar is the world's reserve currency. If somebody in Melbourne trades a dollar-denominated security with someone in Sydney, and they're both domiciled there, should or should not the US have some jurisdiction over that transaction on the grounds that ultimately the dollars will be settled in this country? And probably some people would answer that yes, and some people would answer it no. And I think they're both respectable, principled answers. But here's the thing that has to be balanced. That's a world with one reserve currency. Imagine now there's another world currency, or indeed that we move to a world a bit like the late 19th century when there are really quite a few reserve currencies. And now the issue of a reserve currency on the other side of the world decides that somebody in Idaho that trades with somebody in Massachusetts in a contract denominated in this other currency, should we call it, from a powerful emerging country, and they claim jurisdiction. What kind of place will global finance be if everybody is claiming jurisdiction over transactions everywhere on the basis of either the domicile of the transactors or the issuer of the currency or the center in which the transaction was conducted? I think there is, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I think that is a problem that securities regulators have never really had to confront before, to the extent that they are having to today, and they will have to over the next quarter of a century. Let me conclude. I want to make two preliminary comments. First of all, absolutely nothing I have said is intended to be a criticism of securities regulators. Truly, I think that in this country, the SEC has done a magnificent job over its 80 or so years at ensuring fair and clean markets, not every day or every year, but that's what they've done. I dearly wish that the UK had set up an SEC-type body in the mid-1980s when we had our securities markets reforms and where the club-like regulation that the UK had relied on was no longer viable at all. Secondly, it so happens that in the late 1980s, I was involved in Hong Kong in redesigning their securities markets and infrastructure, and indeed their securities regulator, the Securities and Futures Commission. And I not only remain quite proud of that work, but more importantly for these purposes, I remain deeply grateful to the staff and commissioners then serving in the SEC and the CFTC, who I learned a huge amount from and who I'm endlessly badgered from the other side of the world and sometimes in their offices to help me sort out Hong Kong's problems. So this is, everything I say is not based on lack of esteem or indeed lack of affection for that world, nor is it the case, by the way, that I think that bank supervisors and central banks have covered themselves in glory. On the contrary. But this isn't a kind of competition for turf or a competition in kind of self-mortification and breast beating. What I'm saying is that if so much of our financial commerce now goes through the capital markets, then we cannot rely on traditional bank supervision and central bankers to preserve financial stability. And if securities regulators are to be involved in that endeavor, then I think their mandates and techniques and methods of international decision making will need to adapt. The only other method would be to set up a body above the securities regulators that could override their policy. But that, I think, really would be unpopular with the securities regulators, and one can see that in this country a bit with how they feel about the Financial Stability Oversight Council. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Charles. I'm a student at Princeton, junior in the economics department. My question is related to, you mentioned securities regulators have some degree of sort of independence or not independence from the political system. How do you think that's impacted by how properly functioning the political system in which the country is domiciled is?
I think it plainly is affected by that. But if you take the UK, for example, and I'm going to put the EU on one side for a second, the UK securities regulator is ostensibly more independent than the SEC or the CFTC. Their budget isn't set by either the executive branch or by Parliament, and its leaders have tenure. They could only be sacked for cause. Slightly different in the EU. The EU has a very interesting system, actually, which is the significant rules of the European Securities Market Authority, and in fact some of the other financial authorities, are published in draft, but have to go to the Council of Ministers and to the European Parliament for veto. And so they have effectively allowed democratic control into the process. I don't think that's undermined their independence. I think they do still face the challenge of, so what really is their objective? Not in terms of the fairness and honesty of markets, but in terms of what are they meant to deliver on financial stability. I think that problem is faced more or less everywhere in the world in this field. I didn't explain why. I don't think it is the same degree of challenge in the banking sphere.
Peter Conti Brown. I'm a lawyer and a PhD student in history, focusing on financial history. I want to push you a bit on the idea of tactical control versus strategic control. And I want to think about why the model we have for the SEC, which is subject to an annual appropriations process in Congress, which is an omnibus process, so the SEC's defenders and attackers alike will be inside part of a larger political economic debate about funding the government, and ample statutory discretion, which is a form of independence itself, that can pursue an agenda of investor protection however they interpret it. And the opposing model that you propose, which is take them outside of the appropriations process, but write very specific statutes. My question and concern would be that under the second model, the oversight that you've given is away from Congress through an appropriations process that's actually pretty narrow, and over to an unelected judiciary, because the more detailed the statute, the more likely there's going to be a basis for successful litigation. So instead of having members of Congress that we can yell at and boot out if they're picking on the SEC when we like what they're doing, we've got judges on the DC circuit saying, this entire enterprise, the Volcker rule or whatever else, or proxy access, fails because in subparagraph D178 this word was used and the rulemaking didn't use the same word. So I'm wondering.
These are great questions, and it gives me a chance to clarify. So I don't think I said detailed. I said less vague. So if you think about the mandate of the Bank of England, and I'm deliberately choosing the mandate of the Bank of England rather than the Fed's dual mandate, which does have a degree of vagueness. The mandate of the Bank of England is achieve an inflation target of 2% on average, and subject to that, maintain aggregate demand in line with aggregate supply. The provisions in primary legislation that deliver that are less than a page. The executive branch order that amplifies it a bit under Parliament's control is about 2 to 3 pages. But it doesn't. The point is, it doesn't just say ensure macroeconomic stability. It holds the executive branch to setting an inflation target that couldn't be that has to be described as consistent with price stability. They couldn't set an inflation target of 20% or something like that. And it gives it puts the Bank of England's discretion within a fairly clearly defined ring. The second thing I'd say to your comment, which engages, first of all, I should thank you, this engages with the issues that I'm interested in, is I think in the system I'm describing, there would still be congressional oversight. But it wouldn't be, in the language of political scientists, it wouldn't be fire alarm type oversight. It would be a bit more like police patrol oversight, although I think these metaphors that go back some years now are pretty problematic. Let me say something about fire alarm oversight. So is everybody in the room familiar with these fire alarm police patrol things? Okay, so this is a bunch of political scientists in the 1980s, first half of the 1980s. And they describe a police patrol oversight as checking up on what the congressional committees checking up on what an independent agency is doing across the piece. And that's a kind of pretty difficult thing to do. And so there was a worry, probably in the 70s and the early 80s, that therefore there was no oversight or congressional control over these agencies at all. And the suggestion was, well, actually there is, because what happens is that members of these committees follow up complaints and concerns raised by interest groups or their constituents, the voters, who essentially set off a fire alarm or a smoke alarm would have been a better metaphor, and sort things out. Now, whatever the validity of that metaphor, it is absolutely hopeless for financial stability to rely on fire alarm tests, because it means that the Congressional Committee, or in the UK, the Parliamentary Committee, would only get involved when there was a fire. And this isn't a fire in a house. This isn't even a forest fire. It's not even a fire that's burning down your whole country. It's a fire burning down the world. And waiting for the smoke alarm is too late. What you want to find out is whether this agency is taking that part of its mandate seriously and ensure that the agency is sufficiently transparent that society, academia, media, NGOs are generating opinion and evaluations on whether it's going about its job properly. So I absolutely accept that what I'm outlining requires a different kind of, in this country, congressional oversight. But I think even if everything I say about securities regulators is incorrect, somebody in government is going to be responsible for the executive branch, generally broadly defined, for pursuing financial stability, and Congress is going to have to do generalized oversight of them. They can't rely on fire alarm type tests. So I don't think that completely addresses all of your points, but I think this is a pretty tricky area, frankly, where it's not just the agencies that need to change, it's the idea of parliamentary oversight or congressional oversight that needs to change. There's a very interesting study, by the way, by Cheryl Schoenfeld-Bailey, uses textual monitoring techniques to compare congressional oversight of the FOMC with UK parliamentary oversight of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. And her results suggest that the techniques that are employed by these legislative committees are very different on the two sides of the Atlantic. Anybody else? Yes, please.
So you mentioned 4 areas of regulation: the market microstructure, the derivatives trading, the shadow banking, and insurance. Of all, maybe not insurance, because that's not really regulated by the SEC, but that's probably a whole other question.
Yeah.
Of all those, what do you see needs the most attention, and where do you see sort of the biggest challenge?
In the securities area, I suspect that twofold. This week, I think, maybe last week, the international authorities announced that they're going to set minimum haircuts on securities lending transactions, and already minimum margin requirements on certain derivatives transactions. But on the whole, those are between, certainly for the repo securities lending, they're between banks and non-banks. And they've signaled that they're going to review doing it, applying this to transactions between non-banks and non-banks, which I think they should. But if they get that far, it won't be enough for them to write a static minimum. They are going to need to be able to vary it. I think the biggest thing for them to get away from is there just isn't a static rule book that will do the job. It would be like monetary policy makers saying, actually this happened in the early part of the 19th century at times, didn't it? Where they would just set the interest rate and leave it there for ages, and we've learned that that isn't always the best thing to do. And setting a minimum haircut or a minimum margin requirement and just leaving it there statically, it's going to be far too high some of the time, and it's going to be far too low some of the time. I think that's a really big challenge. The other thing is shadow banking and regulatory arbitrage. I think the money market fund issue revealed that there kind of wasn't urgency about about addressing that issue or recognizing it as a financial stability issue.
How do you deal with the problem of regulatory capture? Because the kinds of people that end up being in the SEC are usually people that were in the industry. So they know people. I mean, it seems like that their thinking is like the industry. And it seems like even if you can't find out that there's direct signals going from the industry with these guys, they're often acting in ways that may be more consistent with the industry than with the public.
Cognitive capture, at least. No, I don't disagree with that at all. It seems to me that there are two principled cases one can make for independent agencies. One is a problem of credible commitment. The other one is capture, but where the crucial judgment is who's more likely to be captured, the agency or Congress/Parliament/the executive government. And first of all, I think that should be explicit in the debates when an independent agency is set up or reformed. And secondly, going back to Peter's question, I think it should absolutely be part of the oversight process. So, the famous story that Bernstein and others documented in the 50s and 60s, that the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was regulating the railways, was ultimately completely captured by the railways. And that was a bad thing. And the worry is, well, why didn't someone spot it was, so the agency was going off the rails. Why didn't someone spot that they were going off the rails and hold them to account? So it seems to me that if the judgment is made that the agency will get captured, well, then it should stay with elected officials and Congress needs somehow to oversee the executive branch. If it is put in an independent agency, Congress needs to oversee that. The only other thing I'd add is transparency helps because people can see what's going on. And the other thing, and I say this not with complete conviction, is that the international element of policy making can help as well. Because if there's some, and I think international policy making in this area is more or less unavoidable. And if the UK securities regulators or central bank or bank regulators are likely to be captured by some bit of their banking industry, well, the regulators from France and America aren't going to care about that very much. Now that, of course, can lead to the worst of all worlds, where the lowest common denominator, so every national sectional interest gets what they want. But then one hopes that transparency would make that blindingly obvious to parliaments, NGOs, the IMF. But this is a massive problem in government. Marcus.
I was just wondering whether I can widen the scope a little bit. You mentioned this jurisdiction over transactions in dollars or foreign currencies. I mean, it turns out to be very powerful also in this financial warfare. Do you have any idea or any thoughts, should this be limited or should this be extended? Might this backfire later on? Or?
Do you mean warfare as in cybercrime type warfare? Or
yes. Or saying, okay, you did this transaction in dollars, hence BNP Paribas has to pay.
Yeah. Well,
there might be other nations retaliating.
So I'm not an expert in that kind of enforcement stuff, but it seems to me, and I think people in the SEC and in Europe have started to talk about this. If technically the same crime has been committed in a number of jurisdictions, plainly it needs to be punished, and it needs to be punished in a way that everybody concerned feels comfortable about, but does it need to be punished everywhere through separate proceedings? And I mean, I end with a question mark because it's not my field, but again, I think if I'd been in that line of business, I think I could almost have made the same speech for a different reason, which is they just haven't had to confront this before, whereas now the same offences have been committed across endless jurisdictions, and it's not just cooperating and providing each other with information, which has been going on for decades. It's who should prosecute, and within federal countries, and not just this one. What happens if at state level and at federal level different agencies want to pursue? So there is a need to address that as well. It's another reason. I don't think that challenges the legitimacy of securities regulation, but it sure presents them with a challenge of reframing things somewhat, I suspect. Harold.
May I go to your answer to Mike's question, whether it's a capture by interests or cognitive capture? Because it seems to me that the kind of oversight you were describing is really probably quite good at discerning if there's a capture, or maybe good at discerning if there's a capture by interests.
Yeah.
But it's really rotten at deciding if there's a cognitive capture, because if you're thinking of your three-phase description, whether you're exuberant or normal or depressed, before 2008, we all thought that we were normal, but in retrospect we think that we were exuberant.
Yes.
And now we think that we're depressed, whereas we may actually be normal. So how do you deal with this cognitive issue?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, and I'm going to have one constructive thing to say about it, but I mean, moving my sights from securities regulators to central banks and monetary policy makers, I mean, this is the charge. There's this joke in the United Kingdom that I heard as a boy, which is neurotics build castles in the air and psychotics move in. Well, central bankers moved into their models. Their framework for thinking about the challenges that were confronting them ended up being cognitively limited because of the tools that they were using. And those tools were not only used by central banks, they were being used by the mainstream economics profession that was overseeing them. And so this is a really, this is groupthink. This isn't, is the other name for that. I think what can help, and I think there are shreds of evidence for this. I mean, some people before the crisis were warning of credit exuberance. That was coming from the BIS. Some people were warning about the search for yield and the creation of Russian doll type structures. But nobody in most countries had been given an absolutely clear responsibility by their parliament or Congress, which is you are responsible for financial stability, and if it's not preserved, you are up in front of us, Congress, Parliament, answering for what's gone on. So I think, I'm assuming now that top officials care about their prestige, which I think they do, and I think if you give them very clear responsibilities, I think they take those responsibilities seriously. I don't think that's an antidote to what you say, but I think if you say to somebody, your job is to identify the risks and be open about them, and we are going to see you once a quarter or once every 6 months and examine you in public on what the risks are and what you're doing about them, you tilt the dial somewhat. Never enough if everyone is completely gripped in deep cognitive groupthink, because everybody has moved, absolutely everybody has moved into their models. What we can do about that, I don't know, to be honest. My guess would be that for a while, people will be a bit more suspicious of their models than they were. Yes, please.
John Chambers, I'm a politics PhD student here at the university. My advisor, Nolan McCarty, here has done a lot of work on this and the interplay between government and political side of it.
Is he here?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Sure.
Okay, I didn't know that.
He's
he has.
Really affable.
Yeah, I'd like to meet him.
I think he's down at the Institute for Advanced Studies, but he's around.
I'll drop him a mail.
Yeah. There are a lot of things that he had to say about this in his book, but one of the problems that we face in our country is the ideological pursuit of deregulation. I mean, even if you make the the SEC more exposed to congressional oversight. They're not going to say, why don't you keep it stable? They're going to say, well, why are you regulating so much? Leave us alone.
Well, some people will say that. I mean, the senator from Massachusetts may not say that.
Well, but what I'm getting at here is there's not consensus in Congress.
Oh no! Look, so this is a big deal. This is a big deal. So I think that one of the necessary conditions for delegating to an independent agency is that society's preferences be broadly stable and that the objective is capable of being framed. So I think that's true for the moment of price stability. It was the basis on which the Bank of England regained independence. And where that leads to, in answer to your question, is I suspect there is broad support for financial stability. I can't imagine many politicians from any wing of any party, more or less true, standing up and saying, great, we need the ceiling to fall down more often. We really need people to be scared about whether their bank will fail, about whether the capital markets will implode. And so I think there's a difference between regulation, deregulation, because deregulation can be a good thing in this area as well, that is designed for that kind of first order objective of the stability of the system on the one hand, and regulatory or deregulatory measures that are to do with protecting investors or fair and efficient markets, where I agree with you, there's a massive spectrum of opinion. So which of course is another challenge with the past regime.
With the past or the?
Well, with that part of the continuing regime, let's say.
I have a very narrow question, but related to this. So here there is the Financial Stability Oversight Committee.
Yeah.
And there's the Office of Financial Research that's supposed to support it. Now, what are your views? What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of these new?
Like all new institutions, they're inevitably work in progress, and some new institutions eventually become ancient embedded institutions with a long history and traditions, and some don't. The Financial Services Authority in the United Kingdom existed for 15 years and then was abolished. So far, the FSOC is controversial with some commissioners who feel that they are not adequately represented on the commission because they themselves aren't members. And I think in part this reflects the fact that the legislation here, the Dodd-Frank legislation, was both a little bit of a trendsetter in the world, a little bit, but was done very early on after the crisis. And it was a jumbo thing doing everything, because there was a window to legislate. If I put the UK to one side, the EU has done things in slices with very rich debates at every stage, learning with what's going on around the world. And more or less than the UK, kind of 3 bites at legislation in the UK, and so probably more time to reflect on institution building. So the equivalent body in the UK has, for good or ill, has more decisive powers than the FSOC does, and that was debated exhaustively in both chambers of our Parliament and indeed in civil society generally. And the consequence of that is that if for the moment people in the UK, if anyone doesn't like the FPC, what they can't do is challenge its legitimacy. It went through a proper process. They may, you know, if it doesn't do a very good job, they'll challenge it down the road, and they should. But for the moment, I can't imagine anyone in the other regulatory agencies saying, I don't accept the authority of the FPC, because say, hold on, this authority was given to the FPC by Parliament after tremendous debate, and somehow that seems to be a little bit less embedded here. But I'm not an expert in your system. Is how I'm going to end that answer. Yeah, they should. You know, if you one of the recipes for a new institution, and this is an indirect answer to your question, is pick a few goals and score them in a way that attracts wide admiration, so that people of all creeds and colours, etc., say, my goodness, that wouldn't have happened without them. You have to do a few things, and you have to do salient things, and you have to go out of your way to explain them in a consistent way, but different language appropriate for different parts of the population and the community, but without ever giving up consistency, because there are people that follow everything you say, and they're checking that you're consistent, whether you're talking to the public or the markets or to Parliament. I think that's a necessary condition for building a good institution, a new institution.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for coming.